Now, from an evolutionary, biological point of view, that's my lapel mic dropped off now. So, does that make any difference, or should I just carry on? I'll just carry on. Okay. I'm falling apart here. It's terrible. God, it will fall off next. I dread to think. So the first thing about emotions, about animals' behavior is that animals have reflexes. These are just automatic responses. Most species avoid aversive things, and they're drawn towards things that are positive and rewarding, straightforward, not very complicated, no thought or emotion required. At the other extreme, we have thought, cognition, the idea of rationally trying to make sense of the environment, thinking our way through complex situations to make the best decision under those circumstances. But in order for that to be an absolutely perfect strategy, you need perfect knowledge. And we never have perfect knowledge. In all walks of life, but particularly I think in social work, we're dealing with uncertainty and lack of perfect knowledge on a day-to-day basis. Emotions are those things that are often triggered when we're in a world where uncertainty and lack of perfect knowledge is our day-to-day business. We have feeling states before we have cognitive states. So the emotions are halfway between automatic reflexes and complex rational thinking states. And because we're a species that are replete with emotions, they're going to saturate not only our practice, but the way we reflect on our practice on a day-to-day basis. And of course, these are the kind of things that social workers will bring to supervision. And these are the kind of things that the supervisor will have to deal with. Not just in the worker with whom he or she is faced, but of course in their own makeup as well, as we saw at the very end when Derek was quizzed by the fool. So an emotion is usually caused, sorry, this is where I look to the heavens again for inspiration. An emotion is usually caused by a person consciously or unconsciously evaluating an event as relevant to a concern. In other words, if this matters to you in a deep, fundamental way, it's very likely to trigger an emotion. That's the goal, and that's important. The emotion is felt as negative when the concern is impeded. We'll come on to sorts of different emotions in a short while. Generally, if it's a threatening, distressing, fearful stimuli, and we saw lots of that in the theatre that we saw a few minutes ago, then the responses tend to be rather predictable. A flight response, get out of this uncomfortable, dangerous situation. A fight response where you start to respond in kind by being verbally aggressive or bringing threats of what you might or might not do legally, procedurally to the situation. Under extreme traumatic conditions, a freeze response is even likely, where basically you just shut down because you haven't got a clue how to react or behave. And sometimes submission and appeasement, when you feel the best strategy is just to tone it down, play safe, get out of here as best you can. Now, each of these kind of defensive reactions will be seen under stressful conditions. The higher the stress, the more likely it is that you're likely to see these kind of responses and behaviors. So emotions are those processes which establish, maintain, change, or terminate the relation between the person and the environment on matters of significance to the person. So emotions are a way of bringing about some kind of resolution of the situation in which you find yourself. And they link with what's important for us in the world of people, things, and happenings. So emotion is not something opposed to reason. Emotions are not opposed to reason. Emotions and their potentiality for guiding and managing thought in a general way are more basic. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is that feelings are a powerful indicator of what that situation perhaps is telling you, literally at a gut level. So sometimes thought isn't sufficient. The body, the feeling states, affective states are actually giving you very good guides, not just as a practitioner, but perhaps particularly as a supervisor, as to what this situation might not just feel like, but actually some of the dynamics that might be driving that degree of feeling and stress. Emotions complement the deficiencies of thinking, and perhaps most important of all, emotions provide the infrastructure for social life. The plans they prompt are largely plans that involve others. The readiness that emotions induce provide outline structures for particular modes of relating. Emotions of happiness and affection provide cooperation, sadness allows for withdrawal from social interaction and the seeking of help, and anger provides for conflict with others. And anxiety makes for wariness and deference. Each emotion produces a different behavioral strategy. So when you're in supervision very often, the kind of strategies that people are using at the emotional level may give you clues and indications about what the experience on the front line is actually like for them. Which of those particular emotional strategies is being used in the context of supervision. So we get approach emotions. These are the positive emotions where generally when you're feeling in a state that's positive, then these draw you towards the situation, the person, the experience. This enhances protection in the case of young children, care, provision of food, social interaction, affiliation, sex and mating. Negative emotions generally are a clue to get out of this situation, to a better place, a less stressful place. Danger, threat, fear, uncertainty, isolation, loss, disgust. So whatever climate you generate as a frontline worker with your client and service user, whatever climate you generate as a supervisor with a practitioner who's having supervision, may in fact be guided by approach or avoidance responses. Those kind of emotional themes in the background will begin to reverberate in that person's presentation of their work and their thinking with you in the context of supervision. Now, this is a little diagram where you can begin to see that there are lots and lots of emotions that human beings have. Simon Baron-Cohen, who's Professor of Developmental Psychology at Cambridge, big expert on autism, but also a big expert on the emotions, has identified over 200 different emotions that we have as a species. By the way, he's the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen, that they look uncannily alike, but don't confuse one with the other. So here he is beginning to look at some of the more refined nuances that emotions present. Now, species that are group living, species where interaction is key to day-to-day practice, have the most complex emotional repertoire. And the more complex our emotional repertoire, because we are a group living species, then the more critical it is that we begin to make sense of our own and other people's emotional states. The further you go down the evolutionary chain of being, the less complex the emotional states tend to be. Non-group living species that don't raise their young from birth tend to have the least complex emotional brains. Your average snake or your average frog, you haven't got a clue what they're thinking when you look at their faces. They are expressionless. But when you start to go through the mammalian species, and particularly when you come to the primates and human beings, we just look and are absorbed by reading faces. So I'm sitting here feeling that the whole thing is falling apart, and I'm looking at your faces, hoping desperately for some kind of reassurance, given the fact that you're all kind social work supervisors. Otherwise, I'm going to stumble and get more and more anxious. So as you're looking at me and working out where I'm at, I'm doing exactly the same with you. But you're a large audience, and I might just lock onto individuals. So someone yawned over there a while back. So was I losing it? Someone comes in late from the loo. The fool can deal with it brilliantly because, of course, he can just use that as an opportunity, whereas I get more and more anxious up here. We read all the time what goes on in complex social, emotional environments.